Hi, class. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 2. We're going to be going through problems 12 through 16. So hold on just a minute and I will share my screen with you. All right, you should be able to see the screen now. And what I've done is I have created an Excel spreadsheet for the problems that we're going to go over today, which is be 5 problems from chapter 2, starting with 12 and going through 16. So right now we're on chapter 2, problem 12B. And what they've given you in your instructions is how to round. These are the same rounding instructions that we talked about previously. And so just read over this and refresh your memory about how to round. Now, the actual problem starts right here. Pat Kuntz is going to receive $725 for a regular 40-hour week and time and a half for overtime. For a work week of 44 hours, compute the following amounts. And then again, they give you some instructions about rounding. So what they want you to do is to compute the regular earnings first in part A. And so we're going to start by doing that. And what you could do is you could just pick up the 725 because that's what they told you were the regular earnings. But I took it a step further to show you how they would calculate that. You would calculate regular earnings by first computing a regular hourly rate. And that regular hourly rate would be based on the regular wages. The regular wages that are paid are $725, and it's for on a weekly basis, and it's for a regular 40-hour work week. Notice they're telling you here that it's 40 hours. So we're going to divide 40 hours into the regular wages to get the regular hourly rate. Notice this regular hourly rate has carried out 3 decimal places. And according to your rounding rules, they wanted you to round hourly rates to 2 decimal places. So I rounded it for you here. When you're computing the regular earnings, what you would do is you would take that rounded amount and multiply it by 40 regular hours, and that would give you 725.20. However, since the problem told you to use 725 as the regular earnings, you really didn't have to compute these 2 steps. I just wanted to show you how to do that because you may have to compute those in the future. The next step that you have to calculate when you are computing the gross earnings, which is also what they've asked you for in this problem. To compute the gross earnings, what we're going to do is we're going to have to determine what the regular earnings were. And then what we would have to determine is what the overtime earnings are. And so in order to compute the overtime earnings, we've got to calculate the overtime rate. And the overtime rate is based on the regular hourly rate. So even though technically to find the regular earnings, we didn't have to find the regular rate, you do have to find the regular rate to compute overtime earnings. And I've already done that for you here. Notice that this rounded part is the regular hourly rate. When you're computing the overtime rate, you're going to pay 1.5 times the amount of the regular hourly rate to get the overtime rate. So what we do is we multiply the regular hourly rate times 1.5, and that will give you the overtime rate. The overtime rate would be carried to 3 decimal points, and then we would round that back to 2 places, or as dollars and cents. To compute the overtime earnings, we need to know what the overtime hours are. Since they told us in this problem that there were 44 total hours and it was a regular 40-hour work week, 4 hours is the amount of our overtime hours. So we simply multiply the overtime rate that we calculated here by 4 hours of overtime hours, and that will give us the overtime earnings. To compute the gross earnings, you're going to add your regular earnings plus your overtime earnings together to get the gross earnings. So we add regular and our overtime earnings together to get the gross earnings. Notice I put out here in bold a little note. You want to use 725 as the regular earnings so that in Cengage it will count your answer correct. If you use the 725.20 and added it to it, technically it'd still be the correct answer, but in Cengage it'll mark it wrong. So do this, use what they've given you, 725, and then add the overtime earnings to it. The next problem, which is problem 13B, is also asking you to calculate amounts. We're going to be Carl LaDusha, and we're going to earn $3,875 each month. And in this problem, they are working 40 hours each week. And they want you to compute the following. They're asking you to compute the hourly rate first. When we know what the amount is per month that they're earning, you must annualize the wages. And to annualize the wages, we take this monthly amount and we multiply it by 12 months in a year, and that will give you the annual earnings. Once we have the annual earnings, we can calculate the weekly earnings by taking the annual earnings that we calculated here and dividing them by 52 weeks in a year. This would give you the weekly earnings. And in order to calculate the hourly rate, we would need to know what the weekly earnings are, and we would need to know how much the employee works on a regular basis each week, which is 40 hours. We'll divide the weekly earnings by 40, and that will give us the hourly rate. And we need to round that hourly rate to 2 decimal places, according to our rounding rules. Once you know the hourly rate, then you multiply it by 1.5 times to get the overtime rate. So what they wanted you to do is they wanted you to calculate first the hourly rate, and this is your hourly rate right here. Then they wanted you to calculate the overtime rate, and it was based on 1.5 times the hourly rate. So the overtime rate is $33.54. And that's all there was to problem 13. I'm going to move to problem 14. And in problem 14, it says Stephanie or Steffi Wilson, a medical secretary, is earning $3,650 monthly for a 37.5-hour work week. Notice in her contract or her agreement with her employer, she's supposed to work 37.5 hours. For overtime, she is going to receive extra pay at the regular hourly rate up to 40 hours worked. Then she would receive time and a half beyond 40 hours in any work week. So they're still basically saying that they don't have to pay overtime until it reaches over 40 hours a week. even though her normal work week is 37 and a half hours, they're still going to pay her the regular hourly rate, even if she works 40 hours. If she works beyond 40 hours, they give her 1.5 time. During one semi-monthly pay period, notice this is semi-monthly this time, so that means she would get paid twice a month. Wilson worked 6 hours overtime. They're telling you in this problem that the total amount of hours worked overtime is 6 hours, but only 2 of those overtime hours were beyond 40 in 1 week. So what that's really saying to you is only 2 hours are going to get time and a half. The other 4 hours are going to get regular time. Before we can compute the amounts that we're going to be paying to Steffi, what we've got to do is, first of all, they asking you to calculate the regular semi-monthly earnings. And what they did is they gave you a monthly earnings amount, but they're paying her semi-monthly. So you can do this in 2 ways. One of the ways is you can annualize the amount of the earnings by taking the monthly earnings and multiplying it by 12 months in a year. That will give you the annual earnings. And then you can take that annual earnings and divide it by 24 semi-monthly pay periods. That will give you 1825. Or you could have said, since this is monthly, if we divide it by 2, that would give her the semi-monthly earnings amount. So there's 2 ways that you can do that. And I've calculated that for you. You can see it in the formula bar there, or I've taken it a couple of steps further here. Now, either way will work, but I prefer taking it out all these long steps. And then when you got to calculate the overtime earnings, it's going to make it a little bit easier for you, because you've got to figure out what the weekly earnings are. And to do that, we would divide the annual earnings that we came up with earlier by 52 weeks. And then once we get 52 weeks as our weekly earnings, then we're going to divide that. Now listen up closely here. Once we find our weekly earnings, we're going to have to divide it by the number of hours in a regular work week. And this employee's work week, her regular hours are 37 and a half hours. So I'm going to divide the weekly earnings by 37 and a half hours, which are her regular working hours, to get the regular rate. This regular rate is then rounded, and then to find the overtime rate, we would multiply the regular rate by 1.5 times. That will give you the overtime rate. Now remember, this employee gets paid her regular rate up to 40 hours. So even though she's working overtime hours of 6 hours, what we need to do is figure out how many actual overtime hours she would be working at a pay rate of 1.5 times. And to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to take the total overtime hours that were given. We're going to subtract the overtime hours after 40 from that. They gave us 2 overtime hours after 40. So the remaining amount is 4 hours that we're going to pay at the regular rate of pay, because up to 40 hours, she gets paid the regular earnings. So since they had total overtime earnings, overtime hours, 6 hours, 2 of those were after 40, so she'd get paid time and a half for those 2 hours. The remaining 4 hours are at the regular rate. So 4 times 22.46 gives you the overtime earnings at the regular rate. Then we would have to find the overtime earnings that are beyond 40 hours. And to do that, we'll take our overtime rate that we calculated here, just bring that amount down, and we're going to multiply it by the 2 hours that they told us in this problem. These were given, that were the hours beyond 40. So when you multiply that out, your overtime earnings beyond 40 hours is $67.38. So if we're finding our overtime earnings, we're going to take the overtime earnings at the regular rate that we calculated earlier right here, and we're going to add to that the overtime earnings for those hours that were beyond 40, which was at time and a half, and that gave you 67.38. These two combined are your total overtime earnings. Once you have your overtime earnings, you're simply going to add the overtime earnings to the semi-monthly earnings to get C, which is your total earnings. So this 1825 was given, or actually we had to find it. That was the semi-monthly earnings that we found from up above right here. And remember, there were 2 ways to get that. And then we're going to add the overtime earnings to that to get the total earnings. On the next problem, Jody Bosch is a salaried employee who normally works a 35-hour work week and is paid a salary of $735. The agreement that he has with his employer states that his salary is to cover all hours worked up to and including 40 hours. This week, Bosch worked 42 hours. So they want you to calculate his gross pay, which would be his regular earnings plus any overtime earnings. So first of all, we have to find the regular weekly earnings, and the regular weekly earnings were given. That was $735. This was a given amount. Then in order to figure out the overtime, we need to know what the hourly rate is. So we've got to calculate his hourly rate, which is his regular earnings, which was given, divided by the normal working hours per week. The normal working hours for this employee was 35 hours. That was a given. So if we divide 35 into 735, that gives us the hourly rate. Then we're going to calculate the overtime rate, which is the hourly rate, which we calculated here, just brought it down, times 1.5 times. That will give you the overtime rate. This is the overtime rate. And then they want you to calculate the overtime earnings. The overtime earnings are the overtime rate, which was $31.50, times 2 hours. Because this employee worked 42 hours, 2 hours are above 40 hours. So these 2 hours are paid at 1.5 times the rate. So these are the overtime earnings of $63. And because this problem stated that the agreement he has with his employer states that his salary is to cover all hours worked up to and including 40. So even though he normally works a 35-hour, this is going to be his salary for 40 hours. But anything above 40 hours, he has to be paid time and a half. So to calculate his regular or his gross pay, we're going to take his regular earnings, which was given, $735 up to 40 hours. Then we're going to add the overtime earnings to that to get his total gross pay. On the last problem that we're going to talk about today, which is problem 16, Our problem states that Colleen Prescott is a salaried employee who works a fluctuating work schedules. That means she can, work different work schedules. But she is paid a fixed salary of $920 each week with an agreement with her employer that overtime over 40 hours will be paid at an extra half rate. Notice that's not 1.5 there, it's just a half rate. And this half rate is based on the actual hours worked. This week she worked 42 hours. Compute the following. So first of all, they want us to compute the overtime earnings. Before we can calculate the overtime earnings, we need to calculate the hourly rate first. The regular earnings per week are 920 earnings. Because she works a fluctuating work schedule and her work schedule is based on the actual hours worked, this employee worked 42 hours. So we have to divide the regular earnings by the actual hours worked. And that will give you a figure similar to this, which I took to 3 decimal places. Now notice that if you leave it in Excel, this should be 21.905. But in Cengage, they didn't do that. They told you to carry it out 3 places and ignore the others. So they would have started with 21.904. In other words, there's a rounding error, I think, in this problem. What they want you to do is to round to 2 decimal places for the hourly amount worked. So technically, if you looked at this, the 2 decimal places is 21.90 because this 4 is not more than 5. But if you carried it out, we really should have rounded this up a penny is what I'm saying. But in Cengage, if you do it that way, they don't like it. So carry it out 3 places because this 4 is not more than 5. You got to leave it at 21.90. And 21.90 times only a half a rate because it stated that they are paid an extra half rate for hours over 40. So half of this hourly rate is $10.95. Take the $10.95 overtime rate, multiply it by 2 hours overtime because they work 42 hours, which is 2 hours over 40, which gives you $21.90 as the overtime earnings. So in this case, in B, they want you to find the total earnings. The regular earnings amount was given. 920 was the regular amount of earnings. The overtime earnings we just found at 21.90, combine the 2 of those together, and that will give you $941.90. So basically what we're seeing here is when we're calculating overtime, you got to really read these problems carefully in Cengage to see what they want. Because an employee, if they have an agreement with the employer, can basically work out anything that they agree to. So make sure you read your instructions carefully. In part C of this, it says if this was a B-low plan, now that's a special plan that has to be agreed upon by the employee with the employer before they are paid. And this B-low plan states that if this was a B-low plan with a pay rate of $21 per hour and a maximum of 45 hours, how much would Prescott be paid for 42 hours? This is a separate problem here. So when you use the B-low plan, which they discuss on page 2-27 of your textbook, the salary is going to be figured by calculating the wages for the maximum number of straight time hours. In this case, the maximum number of hours is 45. That was given. And then you're going to add 1/2 of the regular rate for overtime hours. And those overtime hours would be for 5 hours in this case, because they're working a maximum of 45 hours. So what we have to do is calculate the gross pay. And we're going to calculate the gross pay first by calculating the regular earnings. The regular rate was $21. That was given. And the regular number of hours is 45. That's the maximum hours, 45. So 21 times 45, the maximum hours of straight time pay, would give you the regular earnings. Then we would have to calculate the overtime earnings. And the overtime earnings are going to be at the regular rate of $21 times 1/2 of that, because it's 1/2, not time and a half, but just 1/2. In the below plan, it's just 1/2, which will give you an overtime rate of $10.50. Again, that's $21 divided in 2 will give you $10.50. Then what we're going to have to do is multiply that by the overtime earnings, which would be 5 overtime hours. And 5 overtime hours times $10.50 would give you the overtime earnings. Now, to calculate the gross pay, we're going to take the regular earnings and we're going to add to it the overtime earnings that we calculated to get the gross pay amount. I want you to note this. Note under the below plan that if the hours worked are below, excuse me, below the maximum 45 hours, the weekly amount paid will still be $9.45. If the employee works more than the maximum 45 hours, they would have to be paid an additional amount at 1 1/2 times the regular rate above 45 hours. So even though the hours worked were below 45, in this case, the hours worked were 42 hours. They're wanting to know how much they would be paid for 42 hours, because they have an agreement under the below plan that even though they worked 42 hours, or let's see, even though they worked, 42 hours, that's below the maximum of 45 hours. So the weekly amount would still be $9.45. If the employee worked more than 45 hours, which they didn't in this case, you'd have to pay them at 1 1/2 times the rate. So what we're saying is $9.45 is going to be your regular earnings up to the hours worked of 45. Because these people work below that, we still going to pay them $945. But they are also going to get overtime pay based on the amount of hours that they worked, or they're going to get that straight time pay at 5 hours, which would be above 40 hours. So pay particular attention to these things that I have in bold. They're there to help you And if you want to go back and review about the below plan, look at page 227 when you're calculating that. And that's all I'm going to talk to you about today. I'm going to stop sharing this with you, and I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.